Yeah, yeah. So one can go to, I mean, we can go to Erasmus Darwin's medical work, Zoonomia, which appeared in 1794 and 1796, 2 volumes. And it's there that he is beginning to make very clear some of his thoughts about what plants might be. And one of the most striking things that he says in Zoonomia is that it's possible that plants are really an inferior form of animal life. It's a very striking and unusual speculation that he is prepared to pursue there. And he identifies 4 different forms of motion that one can see in plants and flowers that are comparable to the forms of motion and movement that one sees in animals. So motions of sensibility, irritability, voluntary motions, motions of association. He says these show powers or capacities in plants which really are comparable to the powers of movement and self-direction that one can find in animals.
In the 18th century, the most common way of defining an animal and a plant was codified by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus. Linnaeus said that stones grow, plants grow and live, and animals grow, live, and feel. So the big difference between plants and animals in the 18th century, as they were scientifically defined, was that animals could feel, but plants could not. Now, in the poem The Botanic Garden by Erasmus Darwin, Darwin's plants are very much alive. The plants have human emotions and they can do all kinds of things that plants can't really do, like smiling and kissing and having affairs. Now, of course, these are just poetic devices designed to encourage interest in botany and make the poem more lively. But Darwin really did believe that plants could do certain activities that most people didn't think plants could do. For example, he speaks at length about plants sleeping. He thought that in the evening plants went to sleep, and that they could sort of sense daylight, that they knew when it was nighttime, and that they did have some kind of sense. So for Darwin, the very rigid definitions of plants versus animals and this idea of sensation wasn't quite as rigidly observed as in some other naturalists.
Analogy comes in here, which we're thinking about the way Darwin is trying to compare plants to animals. It comes back to the way he was thinking about analogy, because for Darwin, he looked around at nature and he says in Zoonomia that the great creator of the natural world has stamped organic life with analogy. So, you know, these comparisons between different forms of organic life, analogies between different forms of organic life are out there. They exist in the world, and one needs to trace those in order to understand how, for instance, plants might be compared to animals. So in Zoonomia, he talks about how you can think about digestion as going on in plants and animals in a very similar way. He says you can compare the seeds of plants to the eggs of animals. He says that the root systems of plants are similar to the lacteal systems in animals, and so on and so forth. So he's pursuing that analogy. He's really developing that basic assumption there's analogy, and he's pushing that as far as he can go with it. Okay, so there's an interesting and complicated tradition of thought, I suppose, about analogy in the 18th century, and we can position Darwin in relation to that quite precisely, I think. He says that poetry is a genre that draws on analogy. Poetry uses what he calls licentious analogies, but analogy is something he also says is something used in philosophy and natural philosophy and what we would call science, and he says that science uses rational analogy. I think he's referring here to the idea that, the accepted idea that scientific method can, as well as using experimentation, scientific thought can also develop by using analogy between what we know and what we wish to know. We can use analogy as a means of progressing from one of those things to another, but that analogy can't be ruled by pleasure and enjoyment, I suppose, whereas it's well recognised by people like Addison and Goldsmith and Dryden that analogy is something you can use in poetry as a means of generating enjoyment and wit. The pleasure of in poetry, you can compare different things and you can enjoy the pleasure of that comparison, but the danger is that in philosophy or science, the pleasure there of comparing different things might take you off down the wrong road of scientific discovery. So analogy in one place needs to be strict, analogy in another place is more licentious, as Darwin says. So personification is really important to the poem. It's central sort of poetic conceit. Erasmus Darwin's neighbour at Lichfield, who is also a poet herself, Anna Seward, said that personification is the order of the muse in this poem. The entire thing is ruled by personification. And personification in the 18th century had really quite an important status. It was celebrated by literary theorists as a means of bringing life and animation to poetry, making it pleasurable. And this was recognised by people in the beginning of the 18th century, such as Addison and Dryden, and also people like Oliver Goldsmith praised the personification of the mid-century poets Thomas Gray and William Collins. So personification is recognised as something that poetry does. But Darwin's personification, I'd suggest, is rather different, because if we think about what Thomas Gray is doing, what William Collins is doing with personification, they're often personifying abstract terms such as evening or care or contemplation or melancholy, and using personification to give life to these abstractions. But Darwin is using personification to animate something which is already alive, actually. So he's using personification to extend further qualities of animation and life to plants and flowers, which, you know, we'd recognise are already alive. And I'd suggest that what he's doing is using personification to really pursue a kind of scientific thesis that he has got himself. He's interested in exploring the relationship and the differences between plants and animal life, and personification is something which enables him to go beyond what's possible in science and explore that idea through poetry. I suppose personification, it's a form of analogy, isn't it? It's a form of comparison. So I suppose the pitfalls in relation to personification could be the same pitfalls that analogy might suffer. A personification might not be acceptable because one can't kind of comprehend or understand or accept the form of comparison it's making, in the same way that an analogy may be inappropriate. But romantic critics also objected to personification. One could read Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads as an objection to a Darwinian poetics of personification, and Wordsworth's objection to personification was simply a mechanical means of transforming the language of prose to the language of poetry. So personification for Wordsworth, in his critical account, it's simply a kind of mechanical transformation of a particular kind of language into another kind of language.